wanted to say I'm very honored to introduce such a distinguished author who wrote the highly regarded, New York Times recognized The Address Book, which street addresses reveal about identity, race, wealth, and power. This work was a finalist for the 2020 Crooker's Prize for Nonfiction, was selected as one of the Times Magazine's 100 must-read books of 2020, and was longlisted for 2020 Porchlight Business Book Awards. The Address Book is a collection of carefully strung together narratives that tie people from our communities to people on the other side of the world. As described by the publisher, the complex and fascinating narratives of peoples and histories that illuminate the sometimes hidden stories behind street names and their power to name, to hide, and decide who counts and who doesn't and why. Addresses aren't as simple as we thought. It's astonishing something as mundane as a few names, numbers, and sometimes symbols could hold so much weight around the world. Our well-accomplished author, who graduated from Harvard College, Harvard Law School, the National University of Ireland, and the University of Oxford, curated a project that makes us curious about how we name and navigate places. Let's please give the warmest welcome to Deirdre.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. It makes me want to do these all the time just to sort of boost my self-esteem. But yeah, so today we're going to talk about the Address Book, what street addresses reveal about identity, race, wealth, and power. And I'm going to start, as I often do, with a story. And this story actually begins at my kitchen table in London, in England, which is where I live. And I'm having dinner with my friend, Karina, who is from, there we go, who's from this city. This is not a city I knew before I met Karina. Karina's from Ukraine, and this is a city called Mariupol. I'm probably botching the pronunciation, so forgive me. But you may know Mariupol from the news. So this is Mariupol in February of 2022, or just before, when the Russians came and they invaded it. Mariupol's a really interesting city. It's about the size, population of Oakland. It's an industrial city. It has a steelworks. It's on the Sea of Azov. And as you can tell, it's quite beautiful. But then, as I said, the Russians came and laid siege to Mariupol over 3 months until May. And now Mariupol looks a lot more like this. So this is a picture of Mariupol afterwards. The Ukrainian government has estimated that 20,000 people died during the siege of Mariupol, and over 90% of their buildings were destroyed, and Russia still holds Mariupol. So there's another picture. So when I met Karina, Karina was from Mariupol and was one of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who fled. And she started off in Germany before making it to the UK. And as we're having dinner, the conversation turned to street names. As once you get to know me, you'll know the conversation always turns to street names with me. And she told me a bit of history about Ukrainian street names, which is that when Ukraine got its independence in 1991, the streets were named after Russians. And they wanted to change that. And so they set out to systematically not just get the Russians off their streets, but off their street names. And a lot of these streets were named after this man, who you might recognize as Vladimir Lenin, sort of the architect of the Soviet Union, and there were just Lenin streets everywhere. One village changed their Lenin Street to John Lennon Street, which I thought was pretty amazing. Obviously, John Lennon, not just a Beatle, but a peace activist. But in Mariupol, Karina told me, they changed their Lenin Avenue was called Avenue of Peace, and their Lenin Square became Freedom Square. But what Karina told me was that she was incredibly angry because as soon as the Russians took over Mariupol, what was the first thing they did was that they changed them back. So now, today in Mariupol, you now have Lenin Square again and Lenin Street. And she made the point that this was the first thing that they did. But it didn't surprise me. But interestingly, even though the Ukrainians don't have control over their own street names, this is actually a street sign from Toronto. And so Toronto renamed its street outside the Russian embassy Free Ukraine Street. And the reason for doing this right outside the Russian embassy. Is so, of course, the Russians and the diplomats who walk by every day will see Free Ukraine Street as a protest. And you may ask why we don't do this in the United States, and that's because the embassy in front, the street in front of the embassy of Russia is already named Boris Nemtsov Plaza, after the Russian foe of Putin who was assassinated. So we've already done this against Russia, but with a different adversary. So in DC, they have to walk past Boris Nemtsov Plaza. But lest you think this is just something that other people do, this is a picture taken just at the end of the Second World War. I believe it's Berlin. And this is Sergeant George Kaufman from Arkansas. And you can see what he's doing. He's taking down Adolf Hitler's Strasse, and he's put up a hand-painted sign that says Roosevelt Boulevard. Because this is what we do. This is one of the reasons why I find street names so compelling. We put power, we paint power on the roads. This is the way we express power dynamics and power changes in our society, whether you're the Russians or the Americans. And in fact, it's a longer story that the book tells, but of course, Adolf Hitler, who was a master propagandist, did this as well. Every street in Germany, every town in Germany would have had an Adolf Hitler Strasse, and also, obviously, he was removing, he not only was he exterminating Jewish people, he also took all of their names off the streets. And it's a story that the book tells in much greater detail. But again, you can see Berlin is in total shambles, and yet at the very first meeting of the borough mayors in Berlin, the first thing they're doing is changing the street names. And in some ways it sounds absurd, like what does the street name matter? But actually, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Well, you can't be an Allied force walking around on Adolf Hitler's Strasse. It's completely impossible. And this is why there are some cities like Vukovar in Croatia where their street names have changed 6 times in a century, because with every new power that comes, they feel compelled to change the street names. But how did we get here? So in the book, I talk a lot about ancient Rome. I was a classicist as an undergraduate, and this was one of my favorite chapters. But you know, the Romans, they didn't have street addresses. This is actually a very modern invention. This idea that we have a house number and a street name and our identity is attached to it. And it's really an invention of this time. So this, on the right, you can see there, is Maria Theresa. She was the empress of the Habsburg Empire in the early days, really, of the Enlightenment. And she, and it's important, and of course there were no street addresses at this time, and it's important to kind of put her reign in context, in that this is before governments really start to govern in any way that we think of. You know, in this sort of pre-modern state, you kind of have a ruler who is powerful, but as long as the subjects are, you know, paying their money and being obedient, they don't really care about them, right? They aren't educating them or, you know, treating their diseases or anything like that. But around the time of Enlightenment, which you remember is this time of rationalization and classification and numbers, people start to think differently. States start wanting to do more with their subjects, for better or for worse. And what Maria Theresa wanted to do, and again, she's surrounded by her 16 children, she wanted to fight a lot of wars. She was always embroiled in different wars. And she didn't know who her subjects were. How would she? She had no eyes, as you can say, to see her citizens. But she needed to draft soldiers. She needed a lot of soldiers for her wars and had no way of finding them, really. So she sends her military, and they fan out through all of these towns and villages, and they've made up this ink that's made of charred bones and oil, and they take this thick ink and they paint numbers on every house, and they record who was living in the house at the time in order to find these eligible men. As a side point, Maria Theresa despised Jewish people. She was a huge anti-Semite, and so Jewish numbers were written differently because they were of no use to her. But she goes out and she does this, and here's an example. If you go to Vienna, which is one of my favorite cities in the world, you can see some of the original house numbers there. You'll see it over there. It's actually, I quite like how they did them. You always have to have NO dot the number, like number. And the house numbering scholar told me he thought it was because you had to be respectful to the number. So writing number was like saying Mr. or Mrs. So they had to write NO before each of the numbers. But as she writes these numbers, people lose their minds. They really, really don't want house numbers. And you can see why. Before, they were anonymous to the state. They had privacy. And once you put a house number on a door, you lose that privacy. The state can now do things to you. They can tax you, they can police you, they can govern you. They know this. And so they rebel. And there's a murder, people are hauled into court for defacing their numbers, and all of this happens. But people soon begin to realize that house numbers are actually quite useful. So even in Vienna, they start using them, like Mozart got mail at like 12 different addresses, and they start advertising for puppies using their house numbers. But this leads to this, which is, this is a screenshot of a newspaper from South Africa. You can see that there's a protest, and you can see the headline, "We want house numbers." And here's how this links to the Vienna story, that after you start getting house numbers and after the state starts using it, we start connecting who we are with our identity, who we are and where we live with our identity. It's the way to prove, who we are. So we've all had the experience, for example, of getting a bank account, and the first thing they ask you, name and address. If you ever get pulled over, name and address, they go in together. It's not that anybody's gonna come to your door from the bank, they certainly won't. It's because this is how we prove who we are. But this becomes difficult when you, like millions of people around the world, don't have a street address. And this was really what got me interested when I read the statistic that millions of people, some people even say 1 billion people in the world, don't have street addresses, that at least none that look like any kind of modern street address that we think of today. And people need these because without a street address, it's very difficult to bank, it's difficult to vote, it can be difficult to get a job, it's difficult to get credit, it's impossible to get mail, it's impossible to have private mail because often mail is lumped together in a community center, and people want them and they need them. They're good for governments as well, which is why the World Bank has said that it's one of the cheapest ways of lifting people out of poverty, which sounds very odd, but street addresses allow people, governments to tax their citizens. They allow them to provide services for them, to educate them, to have accurate statistics, to provide electricity and water. All of these things are difficult to do without house numbers. So we get to a point where not only are we not protesting getting them, but we're protesting not having them. And as you can imagine from this, Lamontville, I had to look it up, I didn't know it before, where it was, is a very poor community. I believe it's a township in South Africa. And these are not rich people. As you can see, they are all brown people. And they've been marginalized by not being a part of the addressing fabric. And this reminds me of one of the very first interviews I ever did for this book, was with a voting official in South Africa. And he told me that when he was a child growing up in South Africa, he found, he had a cousin who had a street address. And he thought the cousin was very glamorous because he had a street address. And I thought this was the oddest thing I ever heard, that it could be glamorous to have a house number. But it meant that he was counted, right? That he lived someplace important. He was not living in a place like this. And it reminded me a bit of when you lose your wallet, right? Like you might be able to write in the police report that you lost your credit card or that you lost a $100 bill, but you probably have no idea how many pennies and dimes. This doesn't matter to you. And in some sense, not addressing people is similar. And this is the problem that is happening in many, many parts of the world, but in South Africa as well. So for the book, this is a picture of me in Kolkata in India. And this is the team of people that I sort of followed who were work for a nonprofit that's to address the slums of India. I use the word slum, it's really a term, it's not a very nice word. It's a term of art in India to describe a certain kind of neighborhood where people are squatters. They basically don't own their own land. And they are excluded from the addressing system in Kolkata. And I went, and I basically, as you can see, was just following these guys around as they went to slums all over the city and seeing how they went about their work addressing the city. And again, I came across these ideas that I had seen elsewhere, that people really wanted addresses. There they wanted addresses for banking, but they also wanted to be included. There's a story in the book of a woman coming to find us because she'd been overlooked for an address, and she had the poorest home I had seen, not much of a roof. There was somebody sleeping on the bed, somebody sleeping under the bed, and yet she wanted an address, probably largely because she also wanted to be just included in the social fabric. But it's also difficult to get identification cards and passports and anything at all without one. So that's me there. But lest we think this is a problem just for places like South Africa and India, let me introduce you to Alan Cathead Johnson, who became a friend when I first wrote about West Virginia and its lack of street addresses for the Atlantic magazine. And I had found Alan, who lives in a rural county in West Virginia, a very, very beautiful place in the Appalachian Mountains, an old coal mining county called McDowell County. And until not that long ago, places in rural West Virginia didn't have an address. And Alan really wanted an address for all the reasons we want ours. He wanted to get packages and mail, and he wanted people to know where he lived. So when I found Alan as an outsider, it was nearly impossible, and I discuss this in the book, but people direct their addresses around things like the old radio station or the old sewing factory or the old school. I emphasize a lot of these things are old because it's a place of declining population. So it's almost always things that are sort of shut down. And that's no way to have an address. And it became a public health issue in West Virginia because ambulances were having trouble finding people in these sort of hollers, as they call them. And I spoke to one ambulance driver who told me that sometimes he would have to put on the sirens, and they played sort of a game of hot and cold throughout the hollers, like, am I getting closer? Am I getting further away? I mean, this is not a way of treating someone who's having a stroke. So public health became a huge motivator for addresses. I should say, as a side point, Alan was asked what he wanted his address to be, his street name. And he said, well, there used to be a whole lot of Stacys who lived in this holler, so they called it Stacy Holler Road. That's where Alan lives today. So, but from a public health perspective, addresses are hugely important, not just for ambulances, but about Jon Snow. So not this Jon Snow. Every time I give a lecture, everybody thinks it's this Game of Thrones Jon Snow, but there's a very different Jon Snow. And this is Jon Snow on the left. Jon Snow was a doctor in Victorian London. He was an unusual man. He was sort of from a working class family from the north of England. He walked to London to go to medical school, and he became one of the world's first anesthesiologists. So we're very grateful for the kind of work that he and other anesthesia pioneers did. So he actually gave anesthesia to Queen Victoria for 2 of her childbirths. But because partly he was working class, he didn't live in the fancy bit of London. He actually lived not far away from a part of town called Soho. And if you've ever been to London, if you know London now, you know Soho's full of vegan restaurants and cocktail bars and 5-star hotels. But back then it was, again, for lack of a better word, a slum. It was poverty-stricken, workhouses, really Dickensian. We're talking about sort of Dickensian London here. And he, in his sort of extracurricular time, became an early epidemiologist, an early disease detective, where he was determined to track down the sources of cholera, so that when a cholera outbreak broke out in Soho, he was there on the scene. And so this was at a time when we didn't really have a great germ theory of disease, right? Like, we don't really know anything about germs. They think sort of disease comes from sort of bad smells. But Jon Snow knew better, and he correctly hypothesized that cholera was actually spread through water. And it's a much longer story than this, but he was able to get death certificates, which had house numbers and street names on it. London had long been very well addressed and very well mapped. And he was able to, in just a few days really, form a hypothesis that the contaminated water was from a water pump, and that once the pump was removed, the cholera outbreak would slow down. Again, it's slightly more complicated than that, but that's the basic gist of the story. And later investigations actually found that a baby had had cholera and had died of cholera, and the mother was washing the baby's diapers outside the pump, and the water came in through a crack in the pump, and that was what had sparked the massive outbreak. So we have Jon Snow in this incredibly successful venture to figuring out the sources of the cholera. But Before I forget. So this is the John Snow pub in London, which you should visit if you ever come to London. The pump is actually just on the other side, and you can still see a replica of it. Funny enough, John Snow was a teetotaler. He'd never had a drink in his life, which is absolutely hilarious because obviously these Londoners are not really honoring his memory. So it's a very English take on commemorating a teetotaler, but there you go. There's the John Snow pub. But what John Snow did in Victorian London was not really possible if you fast forward 150 years later to Haiti. So we have Haiti and the massive earthquake of 2010, which many of you will remember. And it's easy to forget what a huge earthquake that was. It killed more people than Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden combined. And to top it all off, they had a massive cholera outbreak that was brought by UN soldiers from Nepal. And when I spoke to people in Haiti who had worked on cholera, they all told me that one of the major hindrances towards finding and treating patients with cholera was the lack of addresses. That Haiti is not even very well mapped, which is shocking, but not so shocking to a lot of people who work in public health. And in fact, Ivan Gayton, who I discuss in the book, who ran the Operation for Doctors Without Borders, he has done the same in other places like Sierra Leone with Ebola. And he says that if he'd had a gazetteer, like a kind of map for Sierra Leone, he thinks they could have wiped out Ebola way sooner because we now know that location and disease are interconnected. And then we get COVID. So this book was written in April 2020, which was fabulous timing, as you can imagine, to write a book. But one of the very exciting things was that we have COVID. So this is a fairly random map. This is actually Honolulu County. As you can tell, it's very early on in the pandemic because we're measuring cases by the single digits. But you probably are used to seeing these kinds of maps where we use zip codes and we use location to map disease, and often this is to target specific areas. So for example, certain zip codes might have access to a vaccine before others, depending on the need and the intensity. We know now, I think better than ever, how much location and disease are connected. But one thing that I find really interesting when I was writing about this, I wrote an article for the Financial Times that was about this place, which is Singapore. Not a place I know a lot about, but it was one of those countries that did extremely well during COVID. They had actually very low rates of COVID. And one of the reasons is that not only they're beyond street addresses, I mean, they're wildly mapped, but it's almost like a surveillance state, really. So they were able to pinpoint people very quickly who had been exposed to COVID and force the isolation and regulate the isolation. But what I found really interesting was that when outbreaks of COVID did happen, they often happened in these places. And this is a migrant dormitory in Singapore, and Singapore relies on thousands of migrants from places like Bangladesh and India to build and take care of these cities. And so when COVID would flare up, it would often be in these migrant dormitories where they weren't really looking, they weren't really finding, they weren't really mapping and surveilling them in the same way. And it's probably, not too far a guess to say that it was because they were migrants and they were poor. And it reminded me of a saying that I remember hearing in law school, which is, when you look into a crowded room, you only see your friends. And in some sense, that's what Singapore was doing. They were doing a very good job with their own citizens, but not a good job at all with those who are most in need. And again, this is a recurring trend when we talk about addresses and location and mapping. And we do this in America as well. So this is a standard stock photo of the homeless, but I think it gets the idea. There's a chapter in my book that talks about homelessness and about the difficulties of not having an address and how we overlook and we ignore and we don't see people who don't have addresses in America, and that often happens to be the homeless. But we're going to change approach a little bit, and I want to get back to that point that I opened with, which is about these commemorative street names and how we got there. So this is a picture of revolutionary France. I should say that Maria Theresa, who I showed before, her daughter was Marie Antoinette, who has obviously played a key role in this revolution. And so we have the French Revolution, The king and queen are gone, but the problem is Paris still looks like Paris. I mean, if you've been to Paris, Paris is fabulous. It is not a humble city at all. And people hated this. So there were people who said, let's just raze Paris. Let's burn it to the ground and start all over. And luckily they decided not to do that. But at the same time, they had to change Paris somehow. So they landed on street names. So they sort of began a propaganda campaign to change streets like from Princess Street to Justice Street. They never fully succeeded in doing this, but they were early adopters of the idea that you could brand street names according to your values. And people around the world pick up on this. So this is a picture from Selma, Alabama, where we have Martin Luther King Jr. Street connecting with Jefferson Davis Street. We have Martin Luther King Jr., obviously, who fought for the civil rights of African Americans, and we have Jeff Davis, who fought to enslave them. And if ever any picture captures power dynamics played on the street and how we try to imprint our views of history on the streets, this is one of them. And Jefferson Davis Avenue actually has now been changed actually to a name of a civil rights lawyer. So this picture is no longer possible in Selma today. But again, this book came out in 2020, and I remember finding it so powerful. And I wrote another article for The Atlantic that was about this, which we all remember how those big yellow letters in front of the White House and also other cities that said Black Lives Matter. And we see these, and it was so powerful to see this just after I wrote this book, because it exemplified so many of the things that I had already been studying. This need to take streets and to rename streets to show some change. And I told this story earlier in the student meeting, but I was talking to a sociologist about this. And he was making this point that when you have a revolution, this is really hard to do. So if you have an invading force come in, it's pretty obvious what's changed. Like the invaders are there. So you're sitting in Paris drinking your coffee and there are people speaking German around you. You know Paris has fallen to the Germans. This is no surprise. But when you have a revolution, as the Parisians found, everything looks the same. You feel different. You feel the world is different, but you need to change something. And so often that change comes in the form of street names. And the way the sociologist described it is, if you can't take the space from the outside, you take the space from the inside. And again, as I said, this taking the space from the inside often looks like street names. Interestingly, in the book, I opened the book by talking about when I was house hunting in London, I looked for a street I was looking at a house on a street called Black Boy Lane, which was in Tottenham, which is the most diverse postcode in all of Europe. It's a kind of an amazing place, really, if you've never been. And there is a street called Black Boy Lane. And I showed this picture, for people who have read the book, they won't know that it was changed. The name was changed this year to La Rose Lane, commemorating the owner of a black bookstore in the area. And but as you can see, people find, even after the street name was changed, ways to express their feelings about the change. And the street sign, is continually defaced. And again, we see how these power dynamics play out. One thing I didn't write about in the book that I really wish I had, and I said this to a student, was gender. Because one of the continuous themes when you read about street names is how much women were left out the map. So when I knew I was coming here, of course, I started to look at street names. It's a complete tick of mine now, I can't help it. And I found this really interesting article by someone named Joe Blackstock that was in the Daily Bulletin, where he was describing how, so this is a map of Pomona, I think Laverne and Claremont are also on here, where he was describing how in Pomona, in the 1870s, the sort of leaders of Pomona gave themselves street names, but they also gave street names to their wives and mothers. So you had streets like Elmina Street and Eleanor Street and Louisa Street and Lottie Street and Ellen Street. And around the 1900s, people started calling these silly feminine names. And I'm going to read you something that one person wrote into a newspaper. He said, "Just think of the impression on a stranger's mind when he is directed to go up Libby or down Ellen or cross over Imogene. A visitor will wonder what kind of town he has struck upon." So again, and And believe it or not, over the years, many of these feminine street names were changed. So Louisa Street became Locust Street, Elmina Street became Elm Street, and many others were changed. A few still exist, and those of you who know Pomona will know them. I know Eleanor Street is still there, for example. This is a project someone could take on. This is completely and utterly absurd. But again, I've often said that those who write the history books also wrote the street names, and I feel like there's no better illustration than this, like right in your own backyard of Pomona. And I'm always struck, speaking of Pomona and speaking of this map right here, by how I live in London. This is a map, a very old map. I think it's from the time of the Great Fire of London. But to be honest, London doesn't look that different from here. The streetscape is a complete nightmare. It's totally tangled. It's an unplanned city. There's a great charm about it as well, if you know London. But look, it's a complete mess. You know, how do you get from one side to the other, memorizing the street names, everything? I mean, you could be a Londoner your whole life and you will never untangle the London map. But I never feel more like home when I come to places like this. This is an old zoning map. Look how neat and tidy your home is. And again, this is the American spirit imprinted on the map. And in the book, I talk quite a lot about how America came to love the grid. A lot of the story involves William Penn, who is the founder, sort of the first American city planner of Philadelphia. He created a grid in Philadelphia partly because in the Great Fire of London, as you can see, all the houses, it was exacerbated because all the houses were so close together. So he sort of set upon a grid which would make it better for fire prevention. And probably, we don't know for sure, but the best guess is he was a Quaker and he believed in equality and humility, and he landed upon this idea of numbering streets. So there are no numbered streets in London. There are virtually no numbered streets in Europe. Europeans do not like them. They take that French Revolutionary approach, but the Americans adopted them. And obviously, almost every major city in America has them. And they also landed on the grid, which was also quite practical for surveying and mapping land to sell it. And so like I was telling somebody today, I always love the moment when I'm flying overseas and I go low enough to see the grid. Because anytime you fly in, you start to see a grid. And it's a powerful expression of American identity. And even though it was quite a practical model, it does show American identity. You know, it was all about rationality and newness and equality. That is not possible in a place like London, at least at the time. The Americans on the map were really imprinting their values, and you can see that in the grid. You could argue today this has changed, these ideals, but they certainly were the ideals at the time, or the ideals that they wanted to at least project. I mean, obviously equality is not one we've been very good at. But there we go. But I'm often asked about the future. So even when I started writing this book a long time ago, people would say, oh, this is kind of pointless, right? Because there's digital addresses and there's GPS and Facebook, and by the time your book comes out, this is going to be totally pointless. And of course, I love to cackle as people's packages piled up on their doorsteps during COVID. It's like, oh, I'm sure you like your address now. But anyway, this is one company I profile in the book. It's a company called What 3 Words, and what they've done is they have mapped every 3 meter by 3 meter square on Earth, and they've assigned it 3 random words so that you can find it. So it's actually quite convenient in a way because, you know, even if you're on a playground, for example, that has a What 3 Words address. So if you wanted somebody to find you in a place that doesn't have an address, it's quite easy. I put in the University of Verne, and this is what I got. Ventures, motivations, caravan. They're random words, but those are pretty good. They're much better than my home. This is where I grew up in North Carolina, which is baked, crumbling necks, would be my What 3 Words address. And I always get, in theory, I always thought when I was profiling companies like this, that this would be the happy ending for the book, right? Because so much of the book is about me discussing addresslessness and the problems of addresslessness, and also discussing all of these arguments that we have over street names, the difficulties with street names, that I really should have been a happy ending. Look, we can get rid of all of these problems just by using these sort of randomly generated words. But something really bothered me about it. And there was one day that I was talking to this cultural geographer in Israel. His name is Maz Azarahu. And he told me, I said, what's my problem? Digital addresses really should be a happy ending for this book. And he said, well, we won't talk about Karl Marx, but we will talk about Karl Marx Street. And this is actually the real Karl Marx Street in Berlin. And I'm going to read from the end of my book to explain why this is important. So arguing about street names has become a way of arguing about fundamental issues in our society, at a time when doing so sometimes feels impossible. How often are we called to take a stand and decide who we are as a community? We lose something of ourselves if we don't keep up the relentless, argument-riddled, community-based work of mapping and naming the places where we live. We should keep talking about Karl Marx Street. History is probably against me. This isn't the first time we have revolutionized the ways we find each other. But in the 18th century, residents protested violently when officials marched through their villages painting numbers on their homes with that thick ink made from oil and charred bones. The people understood the new numbers meant that they could now be found, taxed, policed, and governed whether they liked it or not. They understood that addressing the world is not a neutral act. Do we? So I'm going to end on that note, and I'd love to take questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Do you know if the What Three Words website only uses the English language, or does it also?
No, they're in dozens of languages at this point, I think. They have this interesting thing they would find, obviously London, it's based in London, and it's a good place to have it because there are people of all languages. So they get students and other people who speak languages to go through the map. And part of it's to take out rude words or combinations of words that are rude and figuring out the most popular words to put in different places. So no, they're in many other languages. So each map looks different. They don't just translate one word to another. So it's a big undertaking. But they're out to make money from it, I should point out. This is a profit-making venture, which is one of the reasons why it gives me pause, because I'm reluctant to give so much away to the private sector as our mapping.
I'm curious if your book covers redlining at all.
It does, indeed. So one of the chapters that I don't discuss in the talk is about Martin Luther King Jr. streets, about tracking the fortunes of Martin Luther King Jr. streets and what we think. And that chapter is actually based in St. Louis, which was obviously one of the more vivid examples of redlining and housing covenants. So it's not something I discuss in great length because it veers a little bit away from the topic of addresses itself. But yes, absolutely, that's a big part of it. It's a big part of the story.
Renaming is gentrification. So there's a street in Colton that the name was auctioned off, and a photojournalist decided to call it Dream Street. And he more did it as an expose of the housing industry before the Great Recession.
Amazing.
But then my hometown of Oxnard had literally the other side of the tracks was a farm labor community called La Colonia. And Colonia Road was changed to Camino del Sol.
Wow.
And new housing tracts went on along there.
Yeah.
So have you looked more specifically at what happens when you gentrify?
Yeah, absolutely, a little bit. I mean, I talk a lot about this in Manhattan, which is famous for manipulating the street names. But there is, so I do talk a little bit in the book about how people actively choose pretty names for their streets, like things like Lake Street. You choose Lake Street, you choose, the way that the psychology behind that. But it is interesting, the gentrification, and interestingly, what you find in gentrification. So something I read about recently that I was discussing with a Hawaiian student was how this is happening similarly in Hawaii. That what happened was when Westerners came to Hawaii, of course, they made all the street names English. But now that Hawaiians are no longer a threat, and it's quite cool to be Hawaiian, they're now reclaiming those street names, and under the guise of saying we're embracing the heritage, they're bringing the Hawaiian names back, which all sounds great, except you realize that this is land that people are making money off of because it's a branding exercise that excludes the very peoples whose language it is. So you get these debates about gentrification. But unquestionably, yes, people are changing street names. And sometimes it actually works the opposite way as well. This is true in Boston, that there was a very bad section of town that had a street name. Was it Old Dover? I can't remember what it was. And then it was changed to something sounded fancier. And now it's a fancy area. People want to go back to it. Because again, it's quite cool now to be from this formerly rough part of town. So it's kind of complicated the way people think about gentrification. But yeah, no, definitely.
I'm curious how you see, or how some of the people you work with as you're researching the book see climate change impacting, addressing, and street names in the way we conceive of space around us.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. It wasn't, I mean, I have to admit, it wasn't something really on my radar as I was writing the book. But but a lot of street naming is involved in disaster relief. So something that didn't make it into the book, was actually happened after the book was published, was that I was speaking to people who were dealing with, it's hard to remember now because so many disasters have happened, but you might have remembered the big blast that happened in Beirut. Where there was a blast in Beirut that killed thousands of people. And I spoke to somebody there who was doing a lot of mapping because they were having the problem that Beirut's never been addressed. And they really need to find out who was living in each place to give entitlement for aid. And that this was incredibly difficult without any kind of addressing system. And I did at the time think this is the kind of thing that's going to continue to happen, that the landscape is going to shift and change and more disasters are going to happen, and this kind of need for precise mapping and identification is going to become more important. But I have to admit it's something I need to think about a lot more.
But I was curious as far as quirkiness
Yeah.
goes. What was something, or was there something that you found out that just totally kind of blew your mind?
Oh,
Like, you
yeah.
didn't see
Oh,
that
God,
coming?
the book is just full of them. In fact, it's probably annoying because I'm always putting these little sides in, like there's some juicy tidbit. That Second Street, but according to the census records, Second Street is the most popular, the most common street name in America. Why Second is the interesting question, because a lot of first streets are actually main streets. So so this is a place, again, in Europe, there are no numbered streets. I mean, a few, but none meaningfully. But in America, we've so adopted the numbered street that Second Street, according to census records, is the number one street. So, but the book is full of little tidbits like that where I couldn't help myself giving more and more information. But also, there's a whole chapter on Manhattan, which the whole chapter blew my mind, because in Manhattan, you were allowed to buy, developers can buy street names. So you can have a building that's not on Park Avenue, and you can pay the city for them to give your building a Park Avenue address. It's called Vanity, the city itself calls it vanity street addressing, and it still happens. Rarely now, but it happened a lot in the past.
Hello. So you mentioned how London has more of a winding street.
Yeah.
That America's like more structured system.
Yeah.
Do you see this applied in the culture? How maybe more people are looser, or compared to America, more like structured?
I'd love to do that study. It's so interesting. Whether whether the way the English mind works, and whether the open and friendliness of Americans is attracted to the easiness of getting around their cities. I don't know. There might be something to it. There's something to it definitely about the character of the cities. You know, London's a hard city to get around, but there's lots of charm and surprises at every corner, right? Like you turn a corner and there's this and there's that. Whereas there's a great point in the book, I think, in Manhattan, where I can't remember, it's from the 1950s, where people are always saying, like, how could we make New York more beautiful? Let's make New York more beautiful. And people are like, oh, we'll have more trees and we'll have more flowers. And there's an immigrant to New York, I think he was from Denmark, I can't remember. He says, New York's not supposed to be beautiful. Nothing about it's supposed to be beautiful. It's supposed to be grand and majestic and important. But the beauty of Europe is not possible in New York, because to have that kind of beauty, you need gross income equality, you need robber barons, you need all sorts of kings who are, stealing the labor and the money to build Paris, which is absolutely true, right? It's weird. I travel a lot in Europe, and it's weird. You do go to Paris, and nobody loves Paris as much as I do. And nobody loves Vienna as much as I do. But what are these places built on? I mean, income inequality doesn't capture it, right? It's just forced labor, and so it does make you think. So in some sense, there is some point to it that maybe this grid that's practicable but not necessarily beautiful does capture the American spirit. But I don't know. That would be an interesting thing to think about.
So in LA, we have a phenomena with street gangs being called by
Yes, I've heard of this. Yeah.
street names. And kind of curious if you could speak to that reality, that phenomena, how it fits into the bigger scheme of things regarding
That's really hard.
being taken over.
Yeah, that's really hard. I mean, it's not something I know a lot about, I have to admit. But there is something to the fact that we identify, so it doesn't surprise me, because we identify so closely and so personally with our street names that they become sort of part of our identity. And we have this in the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans, they had these neighborhoods, and they would have their neighborhood written on their coffin. right? Like this is like their identity. Like this, people are so attached to their neighborhood identity. And this comes out often when people are asked to change their street names because they never want to. So for example, Black Boy Lane, a street, this is not a white street. This is a very mixed in every way street. Most people are brown. They didn't want, the closer you got to the street, the less people wanted to change the name in polls because people identify so much with the street. Or there's a chapter in which I talk about changing streets named after Robert E. Lee, where there'd be people interviewed saying, Robert E. Lee, I think he's the worst person that ever walked the face of the earth. I totally disagree with everything he said. But you know what? I grew up on Lee Street. I got married on Lee Street. I had my babies on Lee Street. If you change the name, it'll be something totally different. So it's kind of a sideways way of answering your question that it doesn't surprise me that the same feeling happens among gangs that grow up on a street, that their identity is so tied up with the location and name of the street. What would happen if you changed the name of the street? That would be interesting to see. But I have to admit, it's not something I've studied specifically.
I was curious who typically has a say in whether or not a street gets renamed, and like you mentioned Lee Street, for example, and if there's a street named after a historical figure who's no longer that admirable, who has a say in that?
That's a great question, and it's usually local government. In almost every place, it's the local government. And this is one of the reasons why I think these street naming debates are so powerful, because these aren't debates that basically no one is watching in Congress, right? That maybe is reported in the New York Times. I mean, if you watch, so there's a chapter on Hollywood, Florida, where they were changing Confederate street names, and I didn't go to it, but I live streamed all of it. And there are people surging to get into this local government office to give their testimony about the streets. I mean, people are reading Emancipation Proclamation like in Florida, like on a Tuesday at a local council. I mean, whoa, right? Like it's a way that, I think it's one of the reasons why they generate these debates is because it is totally local. In most places, it's a totally local decision. Now, how people do it in terms of votes and how that works, I think that varies. But these are very much local government decisions.
Hi, I think it was with like an interview with the book club you had done.
Oh, yeah.
You had mentioned you were interested in surveillance.
Yeah.
Is that something you're still considering writing about?
Oh, I should write more about surveillance. I'm kind of thinking, my attention races all the time, so I'm always working on one thing, then moving to another thing. But yes, I'm deeply interested in ideas of surveillance. And again, so much of addressing is about surveillance as well. And, we think of surveillance as being a bad thing. I mean, it's a very French word I talk about. It's like it's wrapped up with the ideas of the terror after the French Revolution. But it is important to think about it also as a good thing. And I think COVID reframed that in a lot of ways, that we had surveillance that was using it as a good way of public health. But how the state sees us and how the state interacts with us, like I said, depends on your vision of the state. I tend to like the state. A lot of people don't. We all have our reasons for doing so, but it's deeply wrapped up in ideas of surveillance. Thanks for watching, whatever that was as well. But I'm very interested in the topic. And it's tied up with transparency as well, which is another topic I'm really interested in.
How do you think so with multiple street names in LA specifically, LA itself, its name is Los Angeles, right? It's a Spanish name.
Yes.
So how do you think the whitewashing of these Spanish names does affect the people who live there or the people who come there too from Hispanic places?
Yeah, well, it's hard, right? Because you can keep going back as well to indigenous names, to whose rights are there to be in these names. I know these are debates that people are having all the time. I can't say, particularly for Los Angeles, but what I can say is that I think it's important that more than ever, I hear these debates just happening. These weren't the conversations I think, I was having when, 25 or 30 years ago. But increasingly, I have a Google alert about things like this. Increasingly, you hear people questioning, why do we have these names? What are these here? We have cities, I mentioned Kolkata, for example. They changed their name from Calcutta to Kolkata. We have people identifying all of these different strands of their identity and their names and asking real good questions exactly like that about what we should do about it. So for me, it's less interesting whether these things change or morph, but just the debates we have around them, which we need to be having. But now I'd be interested in that in Los Angeles in particular.
Do you think that, everything you said about street names, does it transfer onto city names as well?
Oh, I think it does. Yeah, I think there's, something I didn't explore as much. But yeah, no, absolutely. And, city names are really important. And again, as I said, in places like Kolkata, in places in South Africa, there's a constant debate in South Africa over changing the names. And it's not that straightforward because you might take away the Afrikaans name or the English name, but obviously there's not one African language, right? So you get these debates where you have, 8 different languages who are all vying for control, and it's, well, whose name is it? Whose city is this? And again, you get these sort of vivid debates about plurality in any city. So yeah, I imagine a lot of this maps directly onto city names as well.
When you pulled that up in answer to the question about the rational nature of American urban design, it made me think of these British colonials who went to the Middle East. And I'll just read you this from Edward Said. This is,
I love Edward Said.
One of them, he says, "The mind of the Oriental, on the other hand, like his picturesque streets, is eminently wanting in symmetry." And he's comparing that to a European intellect. So it's just kind of interesting that someone from there is saying that there's asymmetry. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting. I get this criticism in Britain a lot because actually the book is, and I think it's probably fair, quite Britain bashing, which is funny because I live in Britain and I love where I live, so I'm not bashing it. But a lot of the history of a lot of these places is colonialism, right? Is the British coming in and imposing their own ideas on what they think is right and proper. And again, it did, for historical reasons, end up often being the British. And Said and Orientalism is so good at unpacking that. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the history of the world in some ways is a lot of the history of this colonialism.
I was wondering, because I know a bunch of people in different countries and stuff that have their own ways of organizing and formatting the street names.
Sure.
And so I know that there's so many different tangents, and obviously you went on to a bunch of tangents in the actual book of it, but how did you find where to stop yourself
with the
when
book?
Writing it and to be able to finish it instead of just
nice.
doing
I think you
more
just get
and more
told.
research?
You just get told, it's like pens up, pencils up, right? You've always had some exams and it's like pencils up. I've always said I could have written this whole book with completely different stories. I had so many different stories and so many people who were really eager. Apparently when you work as an academic on street addresses, nobody's particularly interested in you. So when somebody calls and says, tell me everything about what you know, unsurprisingly, they want to talk about it. And so I had so much more material. So to be honest, it was a bit of a pencils up. And there were chapters that there was at least 2 chapters that got removed just for space purposes to make it a bit less unwieldy. But some of the stuff I've published in other places as well. But yeah, thanks. Great question. Yeah, sure.
I'll let you squeeze one more. Sure.
So I'm curious to know, are there any specific authors or other books that helped you in your research or that kind of inspired you to have a layout or a footprint with what you wanted to do?
I think what I want to do is a little bit different. I kind of knew how to write articles. So the book in some ways, it's a book, but it's really almost like 12 articles. But there were so many thinkers. I mean, I was kind of a lazy thinker when I was in college. I'm amazed when I talk to college groups, the things you guys were thinking about and the theories you're talking about. Like I always say, I think I was watching 90210 reruns. I don't know what I did. It wasn't what you guys are doing. But there are a lot of things. I mean, Edward Said is a great influence and a lot of philosophers and thinkers. And there's a great book called The Color of Law, which is about redlining. I mean, there were all sorts of, often academics. There's a great author. I can't recommend this book enough. I talk about it in the book. A man named James Scott, he's a professor at Yale, and he wrote this book called Seeing Like a State. And it was really interesting. I'll tell the story quickly because I know we're out of time. But he sat down to write a book about why does the state hate people who move around? So why is it a thorn on the side of the state? Think about it. Gypsies, nomads, travelers, anybody who moves around, who doesn't, homeless, anybody who doesn't have an address is a thorn in the side of the state. And what he decided to write as he was writing this book, he decided, well, I'm going to start writing how the state began to see us in general. How did the opposite happen, that the state became deeply interested in its citizens? Because as we know, they used to not be interested in it at all. So it's really kind of a history of modernity and a history of modern governance. And it's very readable. So it's called Seeing Like a State by James Scott. And I think if there's any book that influenced me, it was that one. And it's discussed quite a bit in the book as well.
Wonderful. If you can help me thank.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. And thank you for having me. Thank you, Dean Matthews and the Provost's office and everybody who had me here. The book came out at the start of COVID, so I had so few opportunities to share it in person. So this means a lot to me as well, so thank you.